It's got expanded functionality. Here we go. And we talked about Deborah and Yale, and it was really fun to read Frymer Kinski's unpacking of how their stories are different from other stories in the Bible, and the way the Bible gets characterized differently by the time that it's influenced by Greek culture. And part of tonight's reading really outlines that well. I think tonight's reading gets a little bit lost in all the various different texts and commentaries and such, but the first few pages of those readings I think really help us understand how a text that has a very long life, that is written by many different people over many different centuries for many different audiences and reasons, ends up meaning a whole lot of different things at different times in its history. And it made me think of something that we're going to be dealing with here on June 7th, actually in the sanctuary. I'm co-hosting a interfaith discussion about what the Bible does and doesn't say about LGBTQ folk. So Rabbi David
June
Greenstein,
7th or June 8th?
June 7th
Okay.
at 7:30. It's a Tuesday.
Physically here?
It'll be here, yeah, and we're going to live stream and record it. David Greenstein, who is an amazing Bible scholar, he's retiring. I'm really happy he's retiring. He's my favorite rabbi.
Yeah. Was he the one at Chandra?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, my friend goes there and loves them.
He's
Yeah,
very lovable.
right now. He's been full-size number.
Yeah. And he, so basically what he says, and I've been shown on this since our first planning session, he says the Bible means whatever we say it means. And he says, yes, there's the text, and yes, we can get close to figuring out what the text means, and yes, we can figure out what was happening in the world for this particular author of that book or that chapter. But the usefulness and the danger of the Bible is that it means whatever we say it means. And the smarter we are, the more we're able to make our point that it means what we're trying to say. And it's an important thing to remember. So like what we talk about here, we're talking about points of analysis, angles of interpretation that are hopefully helping us understand the Bible in ways that have meaning and power for us. But I just want to hold on to this notion about how the old meanings of some of these stories transform over time. And we'll look at it specifically with some things as we look at this in the second half of tonight's class. But the first half of tonight's class, we're going to look at the story of Ruth and Naomi. And some of you may remember for a while, we were singing a song. It was a song of the month, where I go, I will go, be loved. Where you go, I will go. Where you go, I will go, be loved. Where you go, I will go. For your people are my people. Your people are mine. Your people are my people. Your divine, my divine. So that is the song based on Ruth.
Yeah.
That some friend of mine brought to us to the Ministers Association. And we can sing it here. I actually don't remember who actually wrote it. I'm not sure.
It's a beautiful song.
Yeah.
So the song is about like sisterhood.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and specifically, your people are my people, your divine, my divine.
Yeah.
That's right out of Ruth and Naomi.
Which I found out.
Yes.
And so it's just a fascinating.
Did we sing it in the round or no?
Maybe Marcus likes to, if we have him in the month, he tries to do.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, just I just
Yeah,
remember
but it could happen in the round, I think, yeah. So cool. All right, so this text beginning on 238 in the Frymer Kinski, and hello, by the way, Foxy.
Hi, Foxy.
Hey, Foxy.
Hello.
I think you can hide just because your camera's not on.
No. I know.
It's all good. Yeah, this is one of those classes I don't want to end, but I guess there's always the next thing. So let's just sort of look at the very beginning of this chapter. and look at the story of Ruth and Naomi. I think the story is remarkably simple until we get to Boaz. I think that is a little more unpacking. But so what Primer Kinsky teaches us here, she says that Hagar left and formed her home lineage. Other women came in and formed the lineages of the Davidic dynasty. These women we may call the throne mothers of Judah. And one of these was Ruth. She's at the opposite pole of the approval-disapproval spectrum from Cosby, the Midianite, who was killed as soon as she came into Israel. Ruth the Moabite came and became the ancestor of King David. And the story tells us this. One of the other things we've looked at the last couple of weeks is how some of the books of the Bible, especially after the kingdom, the civilization of Israel was refounded after exile, was that some of their leaders thought they had to strictly forbid intermarriage with people who didn't fit some kind of test, that they couldn't trace their history to those who were sent into exile and used to be in Israel before they went into exile. And we find in the Bible that not all the authors of the Bible agree with that. So one of the other things that's going to be important for us to remember, I think, going forward, and we'll come back to this too. So this is the other big idea, some of the big ideas tonight is that, number one, that the notions of what a woman is and was, and the notions of women's sexuality and beauty changed significantly from older times of Israel's existence to when it encounters Greek and Roman culture. And we'll look at that more explicitly. The other thing that's very true, similar to what I said earlier, that the Bible means what we say it means, in another sense, this particular Ruth.
Oh, there's Wendy.
Yeah. Hello, and Ruth
Hi, Wendy.
is specifically in conversation with the book of Ezra. The book of Ezra goes out of its way for an entire book to say, don't marry foreign women. And here's Ruth, the book of Ruth, lifting up a foreign woman as the mother of your favorite king.
Wow.
And I think I was really struggling with this today. And then I realized it's all because of our contemporary misunderstanding of what sacred scripture should be. In our culture, in our nation, for some reason, we've been trained to think that the scripture is one, that it tells one story, that it has, one basic truth about this, that, or the other topic. And that is not true. The biblical record contradicts itself, and that is part of exactly the way that the editors wanted it. Otherwise, why would they have kept these books together? Right? The books are assembled in various times throughout history to be called scripture. In more ancient times, and then when they write new books and they add to it, then when they get occupied by the Greeks, they write the Septuagint, which is the 70 books. They found all the sacred books they could. They put them together, knowing that they didn't all say exactly the same thing about the same topics.
Well, you're assuming that was deliberate as opposed to, okay.
I think they could read it. Yeah.
Well, they could certainly read and correct some of them, but if you try to go through all this and correct, every single contradiction, that's it. I don't know. I'm just throwing that out there. Like,
I think, so I hear what you're saying, that I don't think it was too much of a task for them. What else did they have to do with their time?
well, that's
Right? I mean, if they were priests and biblical
right.
scholars,
No, they were just scribes.
that's what they did.
They did. That's
right?
Okay.
But I think we want the answer, not just in American culture, but, in general, in modern Western culture, that we think that there's the right or the most right, and for some reason everything else is nonsense, and that is not the assumption of the editors of the Bible.
So what do you think their goal was in leaving this many contradictions and variances?
That is a great question.
I have an idea.
Let us know what you think, Foxy.
society changes. And as society changes, the rules change.
Mhm.
There's also this concept that we're dealing with, particularly with the religious right, regardless of how you spell that. Somebody got it. That there's only one way to read scripture. And this is saying to us that not only is there not only one way to read scripture, but there's not one right way.
Yeah.
Whether it's religious way or social way or legal way, there's not a single right.
Yes, I think there are arguments you can have about biblical texts that suggest this is the word that's actually there and that's not the word. But then what that word means and what it means in context with the other words is always part of the conversation. It's never simply that this passage has to mean this. Now, I have been known to make some bold claims about biblical literature, but to me, it's more, when I make those bold claims, it's normally more from a legal standpoint, the preponderance of evidence. So for instance, one of the things that's spoken of the most frequently in the biblical text, there's two things. One is protect the poor and the widow, the immigrant and the orphan. It's probably said 80 times in different ways in scripture. Well, if it says it that many times in different places, that's probably a main message of the scripture, right? Preponderance of evidence. So I feel comfortable saying that when I say that in a sermon, right? And there's also, I believe there's 612 times the need to make peace is mentioned in the Bible. So obviously, that is a value that we can say pretty strongly is a core biblical value. Because why else would it be in there so many times, coming out of so many different mouths and so many eras of biblical history? But beyond those handful of things, there's not a whole lot we can say that the Bible means A, B, and C. And that frustrates the bejesus, and yes, I use that word specifically, that frustrates the bejesus out of many contemporary readers, especially us in this American culture where we want to get right to the facts, just the facts, man. And we don't have enough appreciation for the journey and for the engagement and for the exploration and for the conversation and the debate. And so that, yeah.
Reverend Scott, but in my understanding of Judaism is that it questions all the time. Like in rabbinic studies, it's all of a question, and you can get, I guess, the midrash or some of their interpretations that just vary all over the place. And then the other issue is with what was Roman Catholicism. I don't like when they say Christianity for the medieval church, because the medieval church was Roman Catholic. But if you read some of the sermons that were written by people, let's say in the 1200s or the 1300s or whatever, they're constantly questioning it. They're not talking about the Bible as if it's if it's fact. They're coming up with all different types of ideas about what the text would mean.
Yeah, and
it's only recent. It's only like in the mid 19th century or so that we're getting into this literal interpretation of the Bible.
Yep. It first happened in right-wing evangelical circles in this country when what's called the Chicago Statement of Inherency, sometime in the 1880s, and does get adopted, sadly, by some Catholic forces in the 1920s and 30s, because they didn't know how to accommodate some contemporary learning with old doctrine, not even so much the Bible itself, right? Because a lot of the Catholic doctrine is not necessarily biblical, it's traditional.
Right.
didn't it start like, so I'm working on this book, and been reading, it's about Newark and various historical things, and I've been reading and writing about like the founding of Newark and the Puritans, and they were the last, this was the last theocracy, and they were talk about strict, I mean, and then how there was the schism eventually that's really started, or the thing that really put it over the top and were the Episcopalians was when some guy got sanctioned for harvesting his crops on a Sunday after a storm, you know, and,
Yeah.
but it's like, it was very literal and very, you know, way before that, when this country was sort of settled.
No, that's true.
Coming in.
So that's a great history. So Newark, literally the New Ark, was the first theocracy being the Massachusetts Bay Colony,
Yes,
and
right.
then it moved to New Haven,
Right,
Connecticut,
right. And-
because they couldn't control the population in Boston anymore, because it was becoming more cosmopolitan and more diverse. Then they moved to New Haven, and that quickly wasn't good. So then they come to
Then they
Newark,
come
New
to-
Jersey,
yeah.
and that didn't last for long at all.
It's a-
Because we're so close to New York, and New Amsterdam was already a thriving city at that point. By the time they founded Newark, it wasn't of any significant size, but it was already very diverse.
Right, so yeah.
And
so
what were they trying to accomplish?
They were trying
They
to
were
create a
trying to
theocracy.
create the Theocracy of Zion, and they did for a while, and you couldn't vote and you couldn't do anything, or you weren't supposed to own land unless you belonged to the church, and everything was the church, had all the rules, and then it started gradually fading and getting softer, and they changed the rules, and it just transitioned.
So the
over.
church was basically the law making.
Oh, absolutely,
body.
yes.
Just like it had been in Massachusetts,
It was,
in-
it was the last one in this country.
Yeah. They named Newark, Delaware, thinking they could move it down there. but
I
the Swedes
always
wouldn't-
wondered
Oh,
The
that.
really?
Swedes
Is
would
that
not have
true?
anything to do
Is
with it.
that true? I
Yes.
didn't know that.
Yes, it used to be Christiana.
Because there's some debate over this was named after the first minister was from Trent on Newark, or Newark on Trent, whatever it was in
Oh,
England. But
maybe.
then there was some new work in there, and I mean, there's all these things. And
There's all these things.
now it's Newark, as Wendy knows.
Newark. Yeah. So all that stuff was
Anyway.
fascinating. So,
Thank you, that's, I never knew any of
and
that.
so,
Yes, I'll never say wrong.
those tendencies towards theocracy are alive in this country. I mean, look what's happening everywhere from the Supreme Court
Oh my
to,
gosh.
state legislatures.
Yeah.
And, look at what passes for Christianity in this country sometimes. And one of the things that's sadly very true right now is, people honestly believe they should be ruling everyone by their
That's right, that's right.
form of religious belief. For instance, there's a book called it's a book about, I think it's America in the Coming Time. I could have the title wrong, but it was written by Jerry Falwell Sr. And in the introduction, it's in 1983, I believe it's published. He says, basically, this is what he says. He says the Ayatollah has the right idea, just the wrong book.
Oh, boy.
So he told us what he and all his evangelical followers have always wanted was to impose a theocratic regime of extreme control upon the rest of us. That's always what they've always wanted, and we should never forget that. And so this is a popular strain in American culture, and we are here to educate ourselves to push back against it. So getting back to our text, one of the things that this helps us understand is that there are major traditions of Christianity and Judaism and meaningful life-affirming faith journeys that say, I will put things in a book that I'm telling you is divinely inspired that don't agree with each other. And it's your job to read it assiduously, to engage it seriously over your lifetime and figure out what it means for you and what it means for your community. That there isn't just some one sheet that someone can hand you and say, this is what your religion is. So like as you had mentioned, Helen, that Judaism is a rich faith because it encourages and rewards people for writing different interpretations of the sacred book.
You know, Islam does the same thing. The word fatwa, which has a negative connotation in some ways in the West, basically just means an interpretation or a ruling about scripture. So when fatwas are released all the time, but most of them are not something against the West. They're mostly, you know, I think that this passage of the Quran should be looked at in this way, just the way, you know, the Midrash and the Talmud and other rabbinic Judaism looks at different parts of the Hebrew scriptures. And so that's why when people ask me about the Bible, I say I take the Bible seriously. I don't take it literally, right? You know, because you can't just look at it or come to like a workshop and think you got it, you know, because they're the people who are dangerous.
Yeah.
You know, I'll never forget the guy I knew. He was one of those guys who was lovable and he was dangerous because if he had like more than a drink or two, he would start swinging. And so when he got clean, you know, he stopped being addicted to alcohol and drugs and became addicted to Jesus. Not that he had studied the Bible, but, you know, instead of assaulting us with his nonsense, he would assault us with his bizarre understanding of scripture, you know, like we're sitting around in a coffee shop and you're like, I'm David, you know, like, all right, David, you know, yes, I've read that book, but, you know, just, you know, sadly, we empower people to be bad theologians and to bludgeon their friends, family, and strangers in this country because for some reason we think the book is simple.
It's gaslighting though.
Yeah.
It's any other type of gaslighting.
Mhm. There is a book that I read several years ago, and I probably could find it if I looked for it right now, and I can't remember the title, but it had something to do with the benefits of reading the Bible. And one of the things that and his argument is that if people read the Bible, then we wouldn't have a lot of crazy religious right people, etc. And that in Europe, where it is part of the canon for them to read the Bible because they see it as a cultural document mostly, that you don't have a lot of very, very religious people. And the reason why you have that okay, I was frozen for a while. I don't know if you heard me, but
your voice was good.
Okay, but that if people read, for example, in Genesis, if people read the first 2 chapters of Genesis, they would see that there are 2 stories of creation that are diametrically opposed to each other, but nobody does that. So instead, we have a lot of people like your friend who gets out here and who misquotes the Bible left and right because they don't read it. And once people read it and put certain quotes into context, like there was this man I knew, Bill, who said, well, the poor is all, the Bible says the poor is always amongst us. And I said, do you know where that statement in the Bible comes from? Let's go back to where it comes from, and it was when they're washing the feet, when they're using the oil, and Jesus is about to die, et cetera, and he comes and he says that quote. Well, that doesn't mean that we need to ignore the poor and need to ignore creating poverty programs, et cetera, but that is how people use it. And they misuse the Bible because they don't know it. And what this man was arguing was that if people knew the Bible, if they actually read it, then they would start discussing it as a serious, maybe just as a piece of literature instead of something else.
To get people to be to get the masses to be doing that, unfortunately.
No,
I don't believe.
there's a great text that you might be referring to. It might be from John Shelby Sloan, who used to be Episcopal Bishop in Newark, Rescuing the Bible from Fundamentalists. That's one of
That's the book I'm talking about. The
Bible.
Yeah,
They are.
he's rolling over in his grave that I forgot that title. Okay, I'm sorry. Yes.
Oh, all right, so yeah, all that is definitely true. And, it's not just about reading the Bible, it's about studying the Bible. It's not, because, folks who don't have the preparation or aren't using a good study Bible or don't know how to read a text like this, it's a different form of reading, and you really have to think of it as study.
Oh,
Johanna,
just
you
real
were about
quick,
to-
yeah. So is it fair to say, so an edited collection, number one, right, an
Mhm.
edited, an anthology,
Mhm.
without a preface or without a, here's what's collected here and what's, but is it also fair to say
Yeah.
that,
No abstract or something.
yeah, within the stories, within the tales, that there is revision of the tales as that, right? So I'm just sort of thinking in terms of Ruth, there were more, Farmer Kin's case saying,
yeah.
well, this is, likely written this time and
Yeah.
this was written here, and just sort of, okay, all right, just.
Yeah, it's deliberately in conversation with other parts of every book of the Bible is in conversation with other parts of the Bible, either to provide an echo or an amplification or a counterbalance. But interestingly, as much as they could have at some point in history, probably the easiest point would have been when they did the 70 books, the Septuagint in the 3rd century before Jesus, putting all those Bible texts into Greek, that they could have easily edited out the things that the theologians of the time didn't think was the true faith, but they didn't. They kept it all. So what we owe the ancient Israelites more than any other thing is that they were very comfortable with gray areas. They were very comfortable with tension, with competing ideas existing in the same book that they were willing to call sacred. And how do we get more of our fellow Americans to be comfortable with that same peaceful coexistence, even if it's engaged and lively debate? Because there are too many of us. You can't have this conversation with a lot of Christian friends I know. I can't tell them that it's actually a good thing that the Bible doesn't say the same thing, because they'll tell me it actually does say the same thing, because I haven't figured out how to read it, which I am willing to say is particularly not helpful. But because I can read it well enough with guides like Farmer Kinski and say, no, it's saying different things at different times, and that's the real challenge.
Case in point, the last 2 words of the first commandment. If Yahweh is the only deity, why the last 2 words of the first commandment there?
And make sure you refresh all our memories on that.
Thou shalt. Now the verb has disappeared. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. Before me. And yet repeatedly in Jewish history, other gods are honored.
Mm-hmm.
And he never raises hell about the fact other gods are honored until they get to the point where he's being superseded.
That's right. That's right.
So they shouldn't be before him.
And if you're going to quote the Bible as the written word of God, the only thing that we can literally quote him on are the 10 commandments. If you've got an omniscient deity who knows everything from every time, and he puts those last 2 words on there, he is de facto admitting there's other deity worthy of worship.
There you go.
Point that one out to your stuck on the far right friends and see how they go wubba wubba wubba.
Thank you, card.
Quit cracking up, Otter.
These are people, my friends and my family.
Yeah. What?
We have 10.
You knew that was coming. At some point, it was going to come out.
In your,
Our group of friends, yeah.
All right. Well, let's go to Ruth for a little bit. All right. I just want to, if we get nothing out of a class like this, it's like, yeah, it contradicts itself. That's why we have to study it so hard for our whole lives. It's not a book that you read and you're like, oh, I got that. What a great story. No, it's not the kind of book it is.
Done.
I can't wait for the sequel.
No, you know what? I think I'll just go teach it.
I'm gonna stand on the street corner. I got a bullhorn in this class. You want to scream at people as they walk by. There was actually a UU who used to do that in Chicago, but that's a whole other story.
That's concerning.
But it wasn't Bible stuff, it was
Oh.
Marxist stuff, which actually made it worse.
Yeah.
Yeah, true story. Finley Campbell, he was quite a character. Yeah, he was a character, as my grandfather would say.
And what is that?
What's the
A
correct?
character.
Oh, okay, got it, got it.
But if you were a real character, he would call you a character.
Correct.
He called me that more than once.
I'm sure.
So, yeah, so let's look at Ruth again. So we have Ruth situated before the kingdom. And of course, we've learned that she is one of the throne mothers. So of course, she's before the kingdom because she's going to be I think it's great grandma of David. And it happened in the days when the judges judged. I'm on Primer Kinski 239, which is the very beginning of the book of Ruth. And there was a famine in the land. A man went from Bethlehem in Judah to live a while in the fields of Moab, and his wife and his 2 sons. The man's name was Elimelech, and the name of his wife was Naomi. The names of his sons were Mahlon and Kilion, Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. They came to the fields of Moab and stayed there. Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she remained, she and her 2 sons. They married Moabite women. The name of one was Orpah, and the name of the second was Ruth, and they lived there around 10 years. And the 2 of them also died, Mahlon and Kilion, and the woman remained from her 2 children and her son. She arose, she and her daughters-in-law returned from the fields, for she had heard of the fields of Moab, that Yahweh had taken notice of his people to give them food. In other words, the family was ending back in Bethlehem. And so Naomi is like the only real remnant here of the original people who can trace themselves back to the land of Israel, which of course in Ezra is much more important than it becomes here. Continuing on page 239, she left the place where she had stayed and her 2 daughters-in-law with her. They went along the way to return to Judah. Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go, turn back each of you to her mother's house. May Yahweh act benevolently to you as you have acted with the dead and with me. May Yahweh grant you that you will find a resting place, each one in her husband's house." She kissed them, and the 2 lifted up their voices and wept. They said to her, "Indeed, we will return with you, your people." And Naomi said, "Turn back, my daughters. Why should you come with me? Do I have any more sons in my loins that will be your husband? Turn back, my daughters, go, for I have become too old to be a man." In other words, she can't produce any more sons for them to marry. And if I thought I had some hope for that, even if I become a man's tonight and gave birth to sons, would you wait around until they grow up? Should you suffer so in not being married? No, my daughters, even though I am very bitter on your account, but the hand of Yahweh has come against me. And they head back towards Judah. And Naomi blesses the 2 daughters-in-law, sets them free. They offer to return back. But there's a bit of drama here that Primer Kinski points out. But obviously there's she's bitter that she'll have to lose them too, but she's obviously has to do this and be kind to them so they can actually have a life. And so continuing, they lifted up their voices and cried some more. And Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth cleaved to her. She said, "Look, your sister-in-law is returning to her people and to her God. Return. Follow your sister-in-law." That we hear that Orpah means back of the neck, so she turns and leaves. That's her name is in Hebrew. But Ruth said, "Entreat me not to leave you, to return from following you. For wherever you go, I go. Wherever you stay the night, I will stay. Your people are my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there be buried. So shall Yahweh do to me, and so continue to do, if indeed death will separate me." She saw, Naomi saw that she was firmly resolved to go with her. And Naomi stopped speaking to Ruth about it. And Kinski lifts up this notion that it's deliberately very poetic, and apparently more so in the Hebrew, balanced rhythmic phrases here. Because these phrases, they echo with other biblical phrases of covenant and contract. And she explains some of those, as mine, so yours, your people with my people, and with you in war, coming from Chronicles. And then of course, how Jonathan bids farewell to David. that whole relationship, Jonathan and David, is worthy of a whole lot of investigation, because it seems like they were a little bit more than buddies. Go in peace, for we have sworn thus in the name of Yahweh. God will be between me and you, between my seed and your seed forever. As Jonathan says to Yahweh. I mean to David. And so we see this oath and we see this dedication. And I think early in the story, I remember, rereading it, maybe I'm like, well, why is she doing this? Well, she's doing this because the author wants us to learn something about not just Ruth, but what Ruth represents. Because all these tales are trying to tell us something beyond just the literal action of the story. Why else would it be included in what they claim as the sacred text? And so we get to 241. And the two of them went till they came to Bethlehem. The whole town was abuzz about them. The woman said, "Is this Naomi?" She said to them, "Do not call me Naomi," which means pleasant one. "Call me Mara, bitter woman. For Shaddai," that's another name for God, "Shaddai has made things very bitter for me. I went away full, and Yahweh brought me back empty. Why should you call me Naomi when Yahweh has spoken against me? Shaddai has made things bad for me." Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, with her, the one who turned from the fields of Moab. They came to Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. The two of them come back, and the storyteller emphasizes, Weimer Kinski teaches, that Ruth's coming and her balanced relationship with Naomi. And so there's this notion that people go with when there's a divine mission. When it's not just showing solidarity and love. There's something else going on, and that's what we're going to try and uncover. Let's look a little bit at the bottom of page 242 in the Weimer Kinski. This is the second complete paragraph. So I find these awesome observations here. I didn't catch this till I read Weimer Kinski's analysis. God never acts in the book of Ruth.
Yeah.
Nevertheless, God is very present in their minds, and they perceive God's providence in the working out of their destiny. Naomi has no doubts God has decreed her suffering, but she does not really understand God or her own situation. Even if God was the cause of her manlessness, interesting term, God is not her enemy. And the proof, which she does not yet see, is that manlessness is not emptiness.
I love that. That is so.
I really wanted to know what some of you all thought about that phrase.
I know.
Naomi has not returned empty. Ruth has chosen to join her, and they came to Bethlehem. So as you're comfortable telling me so, I invite you to reflect on the phrase "manlessness is not empty."
Oh, that's a wonderful thing. So
tell me what's wonderful about it.
Well, I can reflect on it because I've been married twice, single for quite a number of years in between marriages. And eventually, first I thought, oh, I'll find my prince now, I have my 2 kids and whatever. But then came to realize you can make your life great when you're single. And then now I've been a widow for 5 years. And after going through, kind of rebuilding your life, it's like, manliness is not emptiness. There's plenty of other connections and ways to connect with people in life. So that's why I love that phrase.
I'm always concerned, that, especially for people who are single, whether they choose to be single or they just have had a hard time establishing a relationship, that the Bible must be very difficult for them because it all revolves around getting married and having children and, keeping the seed perpetuated. I always think about that, I'm very comfortable with my decision to not have children, at least this far in life. I think we'll have some. I'll be 60 this summer, so someone might need to throw something at me if I just start having kids now. But I wonder about that, and we try to be sensitive to that actually here in congregational life, both on Sunday morning and we noticed that our first 3 pledge testimonials this year were married couples, and we're like, oh, maybe we should have had someone different in there. It's a different diversity for us to remember to be reflecting, right? Because you know, some people have had a hard time being married, you know, so for some people marriage was hell, right? And so it's important to remember that, you know, and if it wasn't hell, it's not something they want to revisit, right? Right. So, all that's true, and it's okay, that's gotta be okay, that's gotta be okay.
Yeah. See, I've been alone for most of my life because I didn't get married until I was 35. And I had relationships, but I like living alone, right? So I always had my own place. And so, and I like doing things by myself, to be quite honest, is something that I'm, you know, really very aware of. And that's the way it's been all my life. And it could be that way because I was raised almost like I were an only child, because my brother and sisters are a lot older than me. But I never, this is the first time that I have, this has been brought to my attention that maybe the Bible would be difficult for those who did not get married and have children, because I never saw it as difficult for me as someone who really enjoyed and you know, really took advantage of being a single person. And in terms of having children, I was not encouraged to have children. I mean, my mother did not encourage her children to have children, which is really interesting. So my brother doesn't have kids, and he was married for a long time. And my sister only has one son, and I only have one child. So I just never saw that as something that was bad, even though I read the Bible all the time, right? You know, and I was a Roman Catholic, a practicing Catholic until my late 20s, early 30s.
So there's all these different, you know, iterations: single, never married, married, divorced, with kids, without kids, married, without kids, and deciding deliberately not to have kids. And this is just like, it's manlessness. There's no one right way to be. So.
Yeah.
No, go ahead.
Oh, I mean, you know, one of the things that just pops into my head is, and it's been a while since I've looked at some of these data, so, but, you know, thinking about like the ball and chain, the contemporary kind of ball and chain, you know, for heterosexual men, and, you know, right, and to drag around because they can't be manless, you know, but when you look at like remarriage rates, I mean, men are just, the rate of
yes,
remarriage
yes.
and the speed with which
Yes,
in straight
men.
relationships with which men
Yes.
partner back up with women. And just when you look at also things like they ask when they study mental health, and they talk, you know, single women report much higher
Yes.
levels of positive mental health. Single men have much lower,
Right, yes,
like their,
yes.
you know, their mental health, you know, challenges are high. You know, I mean, so
Yeah.
it's just belies, you know, it's sort of like who, you know, if you're going to have any, like who need, like the neediness,
Yeah.
actually the right, you know, anyway, but just, yeah, anyway.
Women form
Good point.
bonds more easily as the whole than men.
We're just also, I think, more resourceful internally because we're built that way, right? We're built to like be resourceful with what's there.
Well, the culture has
yeah.
trained women to have to be that way
Yes.
too,
Yeah.
right?
Yes,
Yeah, like
absolutely.
we can make a meal out of whatever, you know, I'm talking about the archetype.
Oh,
Not
yeah.
like, you know,
Yeah,
my
yeah.
life or anything, but you know, like this idea that women are resourceful with life, right? Just because you're not giving birth doesn't mean that you're not able to use the same energy to breathe life into other things and to mother other things, mother businesses, mother communities, right?
So let me share a story about that. So there's two stories. One's about a woman, one's about. So I'm doing a memorial service now for someone I've never met. They apparently used to come here for a spell. Peggy Flanagan and her husband's name was James Sinberg, and they actually had 7 adopted children. And they're both white, and their children were all either African American or African. And this was they were probably here 20 years ago or more. And Peggy is the one who passed away. She was a founder of Ms. Magazine.
Oh, wow.
And what I learned in speaking to the family is her sense of moral strength really was that she hated to see injustice, and it really especially irritated her when she saw women her age. So she was about 80, I think, when she passed. Women her age who just did what their husbands told them. The stories they told about like how she lost friends because they would quit like a club they were in together, and they would say, why? Oh, my husband doesn't like it. And they would be like, well, who cares what he thinks?
Right.
And she would stop talking to them for the rest of her life.
Wow.
Right. And so you have that like thing, because and she's coming of age, they're in the 60s where people are, that awareness is coming forward. And apparently the biggest insult she could give her sister was, you're acting just like mom, because she saw her mother.
Oh,
So
wow.
there's a whole lot right there. And then I'm remembering this very sweet older man in the congregation I used to serve. He was a lobbyist in Washington, D.C. An anti-gun lobbyist was his name. That's a great memoir called Dodging the Bullet. It's fascinating, wonderful man. And one day, and he was always like very well dressed because he used to being a lobbyist. He was retired by the time I was at that church. And he came in and he didn't look right, and I had a lot of meetings with him in 1 week. It was a social justice meeting and a board meeting and something else. And I'm like, hey man, you don't look all right. He's like, yeah, my wife's visiting her mom. And I'm like thinking, and I'm thinking, what does that mean?
No.
What does that mean? And
You
so,
can't get dressed.
and so he's probably like, yeah, he's still alive. He's almost 90 years old.
That's
So sad.
And so then,
Lord.
and then by Thursday, Wednesday we had the sort of nooners thing, which is like where the retired folks came in, and I noticed all the women are bringing him food. And the flight's been on for like 3 days.
That'd be my dad.
Oh my God.
And,
Are you serious?
and then and then that Sunday he comes in and he looks really bad, and I love the way he's dressed, and he looks like he doesn't feel good, and I'm like, I guess Shannon's still in Philly. Oh yeah, she's still in Philly. Okay, all right. And I say to one of the other women of his age, I'm like, take him out to lunch, he's gonna die. And as someone who was, I turned 20 in 1982, and I thought for a while I was going to be a professional bachelor. I had no problem feeding myself. I still do my own laundry. I actually do everybody's laundry in the house because I can't do any gardening because of my allergies. Right. And so this does not compute with me. The fact that like you and leaving, you can't find a clean shirt. What is that?
That's my mother. Come over.
Really?
Oh my God.
Yeah.
Hey, did my wife's house? My mom's in the hospital. To cook. That's my Disney World.
No, you're a catch,
I
Reverend Scott.
actually
You're a
know-
catch.
I know a couple like that, and she like, I wanted to get this chandelier, we just moved, and they have lots of money, and, Stan won't
Why don't you
go
open my
for
doors
it.
to my
Like,
dad?
let me shoot
Because
myself.
my mom, he like my mom's friend. No.
That's so funny.
Or men who've lived alone, this guy was like single for 10 years in between marriages, but can't cook at all. I mean,
And probably pretty okay with it. Okay with nothing, right?
oh yeah.
I remember
So
women
learned helplessness.
assuming when I was thinking, I remember
They're okay with it, that's worse.
women I would meet, whether I was interested in them or not, they would come to my house and they were really surprised that my house was clean. And I could actually cook a meal for myself.
Yeah.
I mean, one of them actually asked me if I was gay because my house was in a wreck. And I'm like, what kind of man do you What is that?
Oh my God.
And this is the argument for teaching your children everything that they need to know about being an adult, whether
Right.
it's teaching the boys to do the laundry and dishes and mop the floor, or teaching your girls how to maintain the lawnmower and your automobile.
See, my husband, when he married me, he was 45. So he knew how to cook. He did, all of this on his own. And I'm a nervous cook. I can feed myself, but I'm a nervous cook. So it's not something I enjoy doing. So he did it. he did it, right? So then later on, when my son comes up, and my late friend now, Nikki Messiah, taught David how to cook. And David is like so proud when he does these extravagant Thanksgiving meals, you know. So his girlfriends have always gotten a kid, a young man who can cook and who can, you know, do his own laundry and tidy up and stuff like that. So as someone who has ventured out to date, and then I get some guy who wants me to cook and do stuff, and it's like, are you crazy? This is not the person. You know, this is not the person to do those types of things. So anyway,
I'm your date. I'm not your maid.
right.
My wife, who also happens to be your co-minister, is very traditionally feminine, right? She, you know, even though she has her awesome, you know, where she breaks them all.
Strong side, that real.
But like, you know, when we first started dating, she was always like, you know, making my meals and doing my own. I mean, no one had ever done that. We started dating when I was 45 years old.
Wow, okay.
You know, and I'm like, you know, I know where to find a maid. If you don't need to do that, don't do that. Because I was afraid she was doing that because she thought that's what I was putting out that I wanted her to do. You know, and it was really hard for us to negotiate that because, you know, I'm like, don't do this. No, that's not why we're together. I could, you know.
Is that because her mom does that for her dad?
Oh, don't even get me started.
Well, there's another pattern too, which nobody's gonna like,
I'll avoid them, I'll
of men that are raised to take care of themselves. I
Yes.
do know, and this is true for other kinds of social behavior, where then when there's somebody else there to do it for them, then they just don't, right?
Right,
So,
that's right.
I mean,
No,
it's
no,
just like
that's
other, you know,
absolutely
other
right.
things, people
Yeah.
that, you know, people
Well,
who are
that's
raised
right.
with a whole set of beliefs and values, even practices, that doesn't necessarily mean they carry into, you know, their adult life. We
Right.
all do things now, I imagine, that we were socialized not to do, by the way, or do things that don't do things that we were socialized to do. So, I mean, socialization is a huge part of it, but it's also
No, it's
not the, you know,
It's not
there's-
everything.
yeah, I mean,
It's not
there's
everything.
plenty of data that shows like guys that will find, you know, they know better and they can do better, and if they are able to outsource that essentially, you know,
Some
they do,
people-
particularly with, you know, parenting is obviously.
Yeah, my brother cooks and cleans now, his place.
Your brother what?
Cooks and cleans.
Does he?
That's
Yeah.
impressive.
She don't know how to do it.
So she doesn't know how to clean up.
It's a long.
Doesn't know how to do anything except pamper herself.
Don't even get me started.
So finish that story from Virginia when I was serving there. You know, I got curious and I found a lot of men, and they weren't all in their 80s.
Yeah, no.
We're very similar. And so I started really paying attention to that. And I happened to I taught a book about ecofeminism, which is basically the theology. It's like feminist theology that's really looking at, you know, how honoring the earth as part of the journey of being a good woman and understanding your role in society. So it's where ecology and feminist theology sort of intersect. And you know, I was teaching this class, and like two of the older men in the class, you know, said in front of everybody, not just to me, like, yeah, but you know, I just keep hearing this word feminism, and it's hard for me to hear anything else you say. And these are like men at a UU congregation. Right? And so I really want y'all to be paying attention to this and, like, you know, lovingly bring it to me when you notice it. Because I'm sure I've seen it here in a couple of settings. I know you and I have talked about it happening in a particular group that you were involved with. And it's
What
That's a
sexism?
nice thing.
oh yeah, there's definitely
Oh,
sexism.
yeah.
We have sexism and classism in ways we are completely unaware of in all of our congregations. This is not about UU Montclair.
Yeah.
It's just human beings in this culture. And because we are convinced that we're on the right side of so many other things, we often are blind to what we're not doing well. I mean, that's my observation as a leader.
Can I give you two quick examples?
I'd love to.
When I was at the fellowship in Morristown, Unitarian Fellowship.
Oh yeah, they're terrible over there.
Be quiet. They're not, but I know, but they're not to you. I'm just saying, but still. they're richer and they're whatever. But anyway, I was also very different when I joined there. But the point is, there was it was a welcoming congregation.
Mhm. Oh, yeah.
And, oh my God, were people opposed to it? And we had the Gay Activist Alliance used to meet
In the
there on
building, yeah.
Mondays, and then we started a group called something like Mixed Company. It was
Yeah.
gays and straights. And I joined it because my sister doesn't talk to me anymore, but she had just come out and I wasn't comfortable telling my then adolescent kids and whatnot. And anyway, these people there, allegedly so liberal, are like, well, we're welcoming to everyone. Why do we have to be welcome, have an explicit welcome? They pointed to this woman who, oh God. Anyway, no, this woman.
So we have to go too far.
No, they pointed to this one woman who you would know, I'm sure, said like, well, what do you people want? And it was just, and then when the minister went on sabbatical, he told the president, don't deal with this year, but he did anyway in the past. But, and then the other thing was when Anita Hill, in the Anita Hill
Yeah.
days, the men didn't believe her. The men, I'm serious,
Oh, so this is early 90s, okay.
yes, the men were on the whole there were like, oh no.
Wasn't that at the same time as Clinton and the girl?
This was
Monica
no,
Lewinsky?
that was later, yeah.
Okay,
this
but
was
it's the
earlier.
same general era,
About
right?
seven, 6 years.
Yeah,
It's
it
in
was
the
early.
90s.
Sexism, it's
That's
just
so
extreme.
bad,
See
so
it, hate it.
extreme.
Oh, my God.
Right?
Oh. All right,
So
so
toxic.
boy, have we gotten a much more interesting conversation than I thought we were gonna have.
I love
Open
it.
a can of worms.
I love the Ruth story. I
What's
do.
that?
I
And I'll
love the
teach you to
Ruth
ask us
story.
what we think about
Right, right.
manlessness is
Right,
not
right,
emptiness.
right.
Yeah, that's a good point. The open
Yeah,
door.
because we're gonna tell you.
Well, no, it's the next time some fundamentalist tells you that, it's all about whatever they think the family is supposed to be, just, Ruth, showing you, you don't need a man.
But does it say that in the Bible or that's?
Well, it's
Nonetheless,
Right,
it doesn't
okay.
have that language.
It doesn't say it though.
Well, there you go.
nonetheless, you still
Mark.
have the reverse Levirate situation.
That's
What
right.
is that? I don't know what that
The
is.
Levirate, remember a brother died and left his wife barren. And his brother died and left her barren, and they got rid of her. And then because they didn't want the third son to die.
Yeah.
And
Yes,
she-
yes, the father.
And then she
yeah.
seduced her.
And she
father.
seduced the father instead,
That's
because the woman
similar?
was supposed to pass on her bloodline.
Right.
And if you're a widow, that's rather difficult to do.
Yeah.
Now, Ruth, having been accepted by the community and by Boaz, who is not first in line to perform a Levirate or a redemption, as they're calling it.
Yeah, so to be redeemed means that you have your property restored. I think we have different ideas of redemption, but in the Christian culture.
Yeah, we have a very different idea of redemption.
Yeah.
So Boaz calls the men of Naomi's family together and says, "You're first in line. Are you going to take Ruth to wife, so that
Yes, yeah.
Naomi's fields can stay in Naomi's family?" And the man turns it down and hands him his shoe.
Mhm.
So Boaz takes Ruth to wife, and their grandson is David, the king.
Yeah.
So the
And so-
Levirate actually works in both ways, but they put two different titles on it.
They put two different titles on it, and they don't really talk
They
about it
don't
at
call
length.
it that here, yeah.
They
sort
just
of.
show it happening. They show it instead of telling,
Mhm.
right?
Right,
And so what we're supposed to, I think one of the things we're supposed to get from it is because out of this union, which seems to be very, very unusual, it's a foreign woman who is not marrying yet another brother or someone, that close to Naomi. This is who begins the line of their kings.
Yeah.
So it is significant for no other reason that she ends up becoming the grandmother of David.
And yet she's an outsider.
And she's an
Yeah,
outsider.
yeah. And yet all the things they don't want outsiders.
And so that's why the book is meant to encourage this kind of debate. You know, for some reason, and I think some of you had it right when you were saying a lot of these folks who scream about what the Bible really says in God's plan, they actually haven't read the Bible
Right.
intelligently and haven't taken it seriously. But that's why they're so scared when we say, let's talk about where this stuff doesn't agree.
Yes.
Because that's where the real joy is. That's where the real juice is of trying to figure out what we're supposed to do with this text. Not some loudmouth knucklehead screaming at you what you're supposed to believe. Like I had all my life growing up. I mean, my mom used to take me to this church where the guy literally would pound the pulpit and his watch would explode. And I'm sure it was. I'm serious.
Yeah, no, I believe you.
Like anger. And all of it, I actually said to my grandma once, I said, I don't know what I did, Grandma, but I'm never going to do it again. Because I don't want that guy to get mad at me, you know. And that was who I was supposed to revere as pastor. And, you know, oh my God, what abuse.
How scary.
No
Yeah.
kidding.
Yeah, wow.
Think about the people who are attracted to that following in that context.
Yeah.
They want to-
Yeah.
And maybe because
Power.
they've been abused themselves. I mean, we know that abuse has cycles.
Right. So
Right.
this is the kind of
Right.
church you went to when you said when you visited your family, that kind of that.
The one I visited with my family that I spoke about in February was nowhere near that. It was much more studied and sourced and careful theological abuse, but it was still theological abuse. But it wasn't screaming and hollering. It wasn't the complete holy harangue with the pounding and the screaming and getting red in the face and calling people out. And, oh, I took Reverend Anya to a memorial service for a member of my family. And his name was Keith. He was married to my Aunt Barbara. And I didn't know Barbara was going to one of these churches. But as soon as, sometimes when you pull up, you know it's one of them, just kind of the way.
And you would especially know, right? It's like inside baseball, right? On
I
this
know.
one.
And
Right.
so I'm like, really, Barb, this is your chance. And Keith was a hard partying, keyboard playing, you know, rock and roll loving, cigarette smoking, you know, dude, you know. And he's actually said to me late in his life, you know, because I was on my journey to become a minister, and he's like, yeah, I've been going to church. I'm like, oh, okay. He's like, I don't believe all that stuff, and that pastor's a little nuts, but you know, it makes Barb happy, so I go to church with her every Sunday. He actually said that to me almost verbatim, right? And so I'm here and I'm listening to this man scream and holler and pound and get red in the face. And two of the people that I know are Jewish. They're members of Keith's family. He has a family that's interfaith. And they're like sitting near the front row. And this guy, I don't know if he knew it, but he's like screaming and pointing like right at them that they're not, you know, accepting Jesus as their personal Lord and Savior.
Wow.
And even the bikers behind me are like, man, this guy's getting a bit over the top. I can hear him talking, right?
Why didn't they just get up and walk
Was this on?
It's a memorial service.
Yeah, right.
Oh, no, they have you.
That's the only reason you're gonna be there.
So after the service, I have like, you know, like 4 fingernail marks going into my arm. And I'm like, so, oh, you've never been through a holy harangue before, dear? Oh, welcome to my childhood.
I was not making this up. Right?
It's one of those things where you can explain it as much as you want, but until you are subjected to it, you have no idea.
Oh, and what's it called? The aisle call, the altar call, like when you come and accept Jesus.
Yeah, the altar call, yeah.
Yeah, and it's
Yeah.
like, and they're like, you're like, I'm like.
They used to lock the doors there after the collection. He would take the basket. He's like, you know, we're gonna do this again.
Oh, no.
Ushers lock the doors. I'm not kidding. So if you ever see me lock the doors, I maybe early senility setting in. I don't know. Maybe reverting back to a former self.
I'll have 911 speed that up.
But I mean, I know we're making fun, but it is true.
No, it is.
All this, I'm not making any of this up. You know, I can tour and make money. Chris Rock and I could go on tour.
And he opened yet another door.
All right, good, yeah. Sorry. I said reasonable. Anyway, so in the end, we find that Boaz becomes fond of Ruth and is particularly kind to her. I don't quite understand all of the dance that they're doing where she's allowed to glean with the regular gleaners. And
What is glean?
glean means
I mean,
after you have people who go and harvest, and the gleaners come and pick up because there's always
Oh,
like stuff that falls.
around the- Okay.
And it's actually written in the biblical law that you are to leave stuff on the fields for the poor to come and glean.
Okay, I see.
So-
I never heard
That's
that.
a requirement.
Well, and it's just the word glean, maybe it's not the same word.
Right,
I mean, but it's just
you
like, I glean,
got-
I
you
can
gather,
glean. I
yeah,
can-
right, yeah.
That's where it comes from.
Yeah,
That's
yeah, I
its-
never-
that's its
never-
older meaning
Yeah, I
for
never.
it.
I never heard that way before. Interesting.
Yeah, and so, yeah, you were supposed to leave corners of your entire, and you're supposed to leave stuff on the.
That's a
ground.
widow's portion.
Widow's portion, there you go.
Yeah.
My God, what a group of scholars. We got. We
Always
gotta take this show on the
always
road,
learning.
guys.
So she
Yeah.
goes to spend the night with him, but she doesn't sleep with him presumably, or we don't know.
She lies behind him. They use the term nether regions, and some
Yeah,
folks like to
yeah.
read more
Well,
sexuality into
what
that than
else would
others.
never reach its name? I mean,
I think just, not being assertive, just being there close, but not,
okay.
We cuddle.
yeah. But, and he wakes up and she
Yeah,
says,
that's
what,
what-
place your
yeah,
cloak
right.
over me, which apparently is a symbol of coupling, meaning that I'm accepting you as a partner.
Oh.
Yeah, Friar Kinski unpacks that a little bit here. And,
Yeah.
so she speaks
Oh,
about.
uncovered, yeah,
she
the
unpacks-
phrase for uncovering the sexual part, yeah.
Yeah, so the bottom of 247
Yeah, yeah.
in the Friar Kinski. The phrase for uncovering the sexual parts is golroa, but there is no RW here. The phrase gala kanaf appears twice in the Bible. And in the sense of uncover under the robe, but here gala is followed by margalatav. It's self a word that appears only one other time in the Bible. And so it may be possible to understand that word as a rare form of leg, so that Ruth would uncover its legs, but more probably, according to Primer Kinski, this is out of 248. Margalatav is the same formation as Mereshitav, since Mereshitav means at the head, so too from Miguel means at the feet. But in this case, what is Ruth uncovering at his feet? She's uncovering him or herself, and the narrator may be playing with the reader by not making the scene absolutely clear. Once more, there is no biblical inerrancy. So in other words, the Bible means what we need it to mean, what we want it to mean, which is both the beauty and the danger. That's tonight's lesson. Anything
But
else
the
about?
next paragraph, the sentence, but it is clear that Naomi is sending Ruth to do something which is totally inappropriate behavior for a woman and which can lead to scandal and even to abuse.
Yeah. Keep reading that. Keep reading that, because I think she answers why.
Okay, so prostitutes might come to the threshing floor in the middle of the night, but not proper women. And if Ruth were to be seen, the gossips would be busy. Moreover, if Boaz took advantage of her, what recourse would she have? Who would believe that a woman who came to the threshing floor was raped? Naomi's plan presumes that Boaz will prove trustworthy and will continue to act in the spirit of benevolent hesed that he has shown so far. And her plan demands enormous trust from Ruth, who must truly believe that Naomi wants only good for her and is not using her for prostitution. And she must also share Naomi's faith in Boaz. But Ruth agrees to do whatever Naomi suggests.
And that trust is not, misplaced. So whatever happens here, it's a convenient, sweet story, and there's lots of reasons for it to be told. And one of the reasons for it to be told, I'm pretty convinced, isn't simply just to make sure that we understand the intricacies of what happens on the threshing floor. We're supposed to understand that, if this author is speaking to people hundreds of years later, that one of the men that you hold in highest esteem, he is not only of our stock, which goes against so much else of what a lot of some other parts of the Bible are saying, that you have to be this kind of person with this kind of lineage. And it is, and it's this explosion of possibility in interpretation. I think that makes what we're doing so important. So
Is there something in there about, I don't know if you wanted to talk about on 254 when Primer Kinsey talks about the names, right? And if we
oh
were to
yeah,
replace.
why don't you read that out loud?
Oh, sure.
She just, so this is on page
That-
254 where Brian McKinsey puts the meaning of the names in place
Yeah.
of the names themselves, and it actually makes it sound more like an allegory. It's easy to
Yeah.
understand.
Which then, and the reason I raise it, aside from it just being, interesting in itself, is in relation to Wendy's point, right, about danger and risk and trust.
Yeah,
If Boaz is, if it's allegorical, right, then that, so we are to put our trust in Boaz in, which would be so evidently a dangerous, right, situation. But so if we swap the names out with my 1.75 new glasses, but I don't know now that I'm looking at it. Okay. Once many years ago, famine drove my God is King and Pleasant One from Bethlehem in the land of Judah to the land of Moab. There my God is King died. His two sons, Disease and Destruction, married local women, but after a while they too died, leaving only Pleasant One and her two daughters-in-law. When they heard that there was food at Bethlehem, they set out to return. On the way, Pleasant One released her two daughters-in-law and sent them back to begin new lives. Back of the neck, tearfully turned and left, but Dewey stayed with her mother-in-law, now no longer Pleasant One, but bitter woman, for God had killed her men. In Bethlehem, they turned to their kinsman, he who has might. First God, then Pleasant Woman, then Dewey, and then he who has might planned to bring them together. And finally, he who has might married Dewey, and from this union came he who serves, the grandfather of the beloved. So anyway, that just, I was,
and beloved is
that's right.
David. That's, I may not remember that name, but yes, so David is the beloved. So yeah, it's right there.
Why were the sons disease and destruction? I mean,
Well, I think just because they died.
oh,
I don't think it, I don't see any reason this mean that it's suggesting there's something evil or wrong
okay,
about that.
yeah.
They succumbed to disease.
Oh,
So that's how I read it.
Okay.
Because the story doesn't tell us that they were bad men.
No,
They
not
just-
at all, right,
died.
they just died.
and there's nothing, and so then there's nothing that's sort of historical, right? Like would there have been, would this been an allegory for, a historical moment, right, as well? Or I don't
It's
know,
hard to
it's
figure that out because it seems like there's a lot of times when there's famine in Israel or Judah proper. And
Okay.
I think they're going to Egypt, they're going to other
Yeah,
places
yeah.
frequently to find food and to keep their people alive. And so I don't think there's anything out of the ordinary that, and of
Yeah.
course, once again, the Bible's trying to echo all these old tales. You were, as we went to Egypt, again, we're going somewhere else. It's very similar to the
Yeah.
old tales. It's very similar that, we're having, Naomi in many ways, like Rebecca, is, and even Sarah, Naomi is going out of her way to make something happen that isn't exactly in line with the custom, right? Rebecca gives the gift of the firstborn to the secondborn, right? And here Naomi, look, it's a foreign-born woman, and it's not really one of my blood relatives, but I'm finding her a mate. Yeah. And once again, women are in control and are actually setting up what's going to happen in the history of these people. Anyway, a couple more things to notice about this chapter, which I found fascinating. It does tell us a little bit about the Israelites' notions of property rights, and this is something that echoes to the ages. Primer Kinsey doesn't really go there, but in page 255, Primer Kinsey sort of realizes the Book of Ruth assumes that property should rightly belong to the original
Yeah,
owners.
it's the same conflict today.
It's the same
That's what I
conflict.
heard. I
We're the
heard
chosen
that,
people.
yeah.
This is our land. What are you
Yeah.
doing here, right? And then at the end of the next paragraph, according to the covenant the men made with Ezra, those who did not renounce their wives would no longer be considered members of the community. Yet here we're being given a hero in Ruth, who's the grandfather of the beloved king. So what are we to make of this?
Well-
Whatever we need to make of it.
And I think you mentioned that, you may have talked about this last week, or we did the week before, but, thinking about also, to your point, some of that there can only be concern if actually there is, right, some right for women to inherit,
Yeah.
right? I mean, to that, right, like, so, yeah,
Oh, right,
that there's none of
yeah.
that.
Why do you have
Only
to-
for that to be an anxiety, a cultural anxiety, or.
Why do they have to so many stories of the same thing
Right,
if there wasn't a
yeah,
possibility that it
Right,
could be
right,
otherwise?
right.
Yeah.
And I
That's
can't remember where she, I don't think it was in the book.
No, she talks about that elsewhere. Yeah, I
Great.
can't remember which
Yeah.
story that was either.
Yeah, Dinah, maybe.
Yeah.
When was Ruth written? What was going on with the Jews when Ruth was written, when the book of Ruth was written?
Yeah, so I believe they think that Ruth is written around the same time that Chronicles and probably after Ezra. So
Where are they? Are they in exile? Are they back?
They're back.
they're back from exile, and a lot of scholars think that Ruth is written specifically as a counterbalance to Ezra. All this talk of probably a generation later when it wasn't so big, what one generation thinks is the most important thing, 20 years from now is like, why were we all worked up about that?
Dissenting opinion.
And it's a dissenting opinion, but it probably really isn't written and disseminated until a little bit later. That's the best guess that I was able to get about that. My study Bible doesn't really put a date on its authorship, but somewhere in that 4th century, before the Christian era, before the encounter with Greek culture. Let's just look at a couple of things and then we'll set up for next week, because you guys got me wound up tonight. I swore I was gonna go crazy tonight, and you guys have an effect on me. A good one, I think. So I asked you to read 333 to some pages. We're not going to go through all that. I'm just going to pick up a couple of things and ask you if there's anything that you noticed or want to share. At the bottom of 333, this is Women of Metaphors of Women. She brings in some more contemporary, 20th century, late 20th century notions at the bottom of that page. The narrators understand a profound lesson that we keep rediscovering anew. The personal is political. The events of a person's life are not determined solely by his or her personal characteristics and motives. People may choose how they act from their own perspective and for their own purposes, but their intentions do not assure results. Life is not fair, as we say. The intersection of an individual with structures and institutions of society often determines the outcome of that person's act, as much as his or her desires for personal or gender. Biblical authors tell us about individual women and men precisely at the moment when their stories illuminate the social structure, political events, and cultural patterns of the day. To these authors, their characters, apart from the grand historical figures, are as much archetypes as they are individuals, and the specific plots of their stories are simultaneously unique to their lives and paradigms for all the similar events that could have taken place in the history of Israel. Stories are about individuals, and yet when they are read with reference to one another, they do not seem to be about their characters at all. It's just another nice way to think about biblical stories when we're trying to unpack them.
You mean as allegory?
Yeah, they're not always just historical. They're not always just about one person or one small group of people.
Like
And
composite?
when you read the sermons, the Roman Catholic sermons in the Middle Ages, that's how they dealt with these stories, as allegories, as metaphors, as, dealing with symbols. They were not talking about it as if they were real, that they actually happened.
Yeah, there's a lot of evidence to that. There's a great book, essay, Stephen Prinker. It's fascinating, and it deals both with biblical interpretation, the history of biblical interpretation, and with art history. And to make his point, I don't know if I can find this, probably in the book that's long lost. but I remember his name, Stephen Fricker, I think is his name. And he takes two pictures of a similar event, one that was drawn before the discovery or the widespread use of perspective, and one after. And in the picture that's drawn before the widespread use of perspective in painting and drawing, all these different characters from different biblical ages exist in the same screen.
It's just flat, yeah.
Mhm.
Once we get to things having to be naturalistic or having to represent the reality as we perceive it, that stops happening. So the notion that these stories are tales for us to understand and use in our own way as allegory gets lost in some ways, both with developments in art, and it also gets lost in part after the Protestant Reformation. In this regard, the Protestant Reformation is enabled in many ways by the printing press. And as wonderful as the explosion in literacy becomes, in the 1480s, I think 7% of Europe is literate. By the 1570s, almost 65% of Europe is literate, right? Because of it. What it means is now those who think they're good theologians or want to use the Bible to control you can say, but it says right here.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And since everyone can read those words, literacy in that age and in our age has the unfortunate negative consequence that it makes people think they know more than they know.
Interesting, yeah.
So both of those things are, it's an important thing to teach, because it's sort of counterintuitive. Of course, we got smarter after literacy. Well, maybe not.
Yeah.
Because it's not etched in stone. We have stone in the form of paper everywhere, and I can write it down. And the act of putting something down has power.
Well, it's like on the internet now. It says it on the internet.
Okay.
I mean, I Googled it after all, right?
Right,
Yeah.
right.
At least you Googled it. I'm trying to see on Facebook, it's true.
Yeah, but
Well,
something else also took place was that following what you were saying, Reverend Scott, was that because so many people were reading, they were interpreting it on their own, right? And so then you have these theologians or people like Luther and Calvin and so forth saying, we can't have like 50 different ways of doing this. We have to come up with one way of thinking. And that's when you start getting these theocracies and stuff where these leaders of Protestant sects start coming down and saying, you must believe this, or else we're going to, literally burn you, right?
I mean, the Catholic Church was concerned about the consistency of doctrine and about things being taught in a certain way. But they weren't hounding, the average priest in the middle of France for not teaching free to the doctrine. But with Protestantism, that kind of overarching demand for everyone teaching the same thing and at the same time, that's why the lectionary comes up. So everyone's teaching on the same lessons each week. It becomes much more rigid in ways that I think you don't understand. Johanna, first Helen, then Johanna.
No.
First time what?
Oh, you were saying something and
No,
okay.
I don't think so.
Johanna.
No,
you have anything for us?
you wanted to, I'll save it for next week. It's for, trust me,
Okay.
go ahead. Yeah.
All right, well, in that case,
Wow.
you all need to bring me some stories next week, because I've told all the stories this week. And that's
Anyone
really
else
not.
stories tonight? Okay.
Oh, I got some little stories.
There you go. But I really want us to pay attention to what we might be missing, in an age that is literate and assumes it knows more than it might.
Yeah.
One of the things that Luther preached, which has some beauty to it, but there's always a shadow side, right? He talked about the priesthood of all believers. Like we all have the ability to be sanctified in the way that we dedicate our lives, in the way that we understand ourselves in the place of the holy universe as well as the universe. But the other piece of that is this notion that I can be sitting alone in my room without, study or colleagues, and I somehow, without even a tool like this, with just, the old King James version of the Bible where all Jesus's and God's words are in red, and somehow I can just figure it out. And I don't think that's true.
Right.
I don't think that's true for most people. You can figure some things out, but it is way too complex a book to try and figure out alone, and to just read it, think that the simple, plain language that you're encountering, actually is what you think it is. Especially if you don't understand the history or notions of the ancient languages, or how translation changed things, or the different authorship over years, over the centuries, with different audiences and different agendas. There's no way. I think that's the big mistake Protestantism made, so there we go.
Well, and I will then say, to tie back to Helen's point earlier about, the impact of our educational systems and what's happening in educational systems, to, Wendy's points that she's been making about, learning the tales, and that, there is a relationship now, or there is a connection between, think like Mark Zuckerberg and all, all the sort of Davos men who are in ed tech now, that really think that where we all should go here and globally is that students should teach themselves. They should teach themselves through Google or whatever, they should, we don't need teachers. I mean, we don't need people to guide us. It's just, here's the content, go learn it, and we'll start them young on the phone, and they're gonna educate everybody on their phone. I mean, and I hope, I know I sound like maybe I'm overstating things, but trust me.
No, I talked to you about that with my son with the asynchronous.
Right, I mean, this
class
is
school,
K through 12 higher ed, like that, you don't need, to actually be in community with other people who may actually have, studied. You don't need to, you can just, there it is. I mean,
Say nothing about people with divergent thought.
That's right. Divergent thought, divergent points of view, divergent experiences. It suggests somehow that knowledge is not culturally conditioned, and that there's no social location of the authorship of the things that we're telling people that you need to digest.
Speaks for
as
itself.
truth. It speaks for itself.
They're facts, they speak for themselves.
And that's just simple.
Right.
The only thing that might speak for itself is a thermometer. I don't know, I don't know. You could look at it, and the mercury's at between 78 and 79. I'm like, oh, it's about 78.
Depends on what you think about science.
Yeah. What's that?
I mean, it depends on what you think about science. Then.
Depends on what you
That's right.
So you guys are uncovering every bit of nonsense in our culture just through these amazing stories. So keep your ears and eyes open for any of the stuff we talked about, any of the sexism that I'm sure you won't witness anywhere around our spaces. And find a way to see it and
Hey,
to
Mary.
respond to it
Hi,
well.
Dr. Mary.
Hi. I was on another webcam. I was on another Zoom for
Okay.
Death and Dying with Dignity. So that's why I was late.
Hello and good night. Good night.
Happy to see you, Mary.
We're
Thank you.
what to do with this class, what it means for us.
Yeah.
And then if you all might be willing to join me in presenting some of our fun,
Yeah.
wouldn't be until autumn, is my guess.
That would be fun.
Love you guys. Take
Thank
care.
you.
Reverend Scott, I have a question for you. How